This was the second quarter of my project comparing components. And just to revisit sort of the purpose and motivation behind this work, it's really just rooted in the idea that web development evolves super quickly, and there are few consistent best practices for HTML and CSS as a result. So people and companies develop their own best practices, but they're usually pretty opaque and difficult for novice or intermediate web developers to really understand or use for their own purposes. And so this project really leverages the idea that common components and web design trends appear across multiple sites, and provides tools to basically identify, survey, and understand differences between those websites in a way that goes a little bit beyond just showing the differences in code, but tries to really surface the design decisions or nuances that really go into how this code is structured, what the outcomes are, what the trade-offs are. And so what this project seeks to do is extract these common practices and context-based insights to help web developers understand, again, the design decisions and trade-offs that exist in HTML and CSS components among professional websites. So the related work you can read in this write-up here, but basically it builds off of work in the following areas. One, learning from real-world examples, both in the context of uh, real websites as well as how it can also help programmers identify um, and level up basically in their learning. It's two, comparing content across web pages. I've read a few papers about how HTML and CSS is sort of retargeted between pages, whereas my project proposes to um, come up with its own set of comparison metrics for HTML and soon CSS in order to additionally balance visual and semantic outcomes of website components, but in a way that isn't really just swapping elements between pages, but really trying to figure out what are the differences and why those exist or what people can get out of those. Three, how programmers learn and their learning barriers, and this really just sort of informs a lot of the design decisions that I'll discuss in a bit. And finally, just the idea of decomposing web pages. A lot of the focus of this particular quarter has been simplification and decomposition of HTML, as well as how we can surface differences, structural differences in that code. And so recap of the quarter was really first solidifying the need finding. Now that I sort of had the goal in mind, was really just to prioritize some hypotheses I had, solidifying the user needs, and just start going to the drawing board and really making sure that I was mapping all of the design needs of my user classes to concrete problems, and mapping those again to actual features that end up in the interface, which you can see here. This was sort of the original thing I tested, which again showing code differences. It was going in a little bit of a different direction of a little too broad in retrospect. Trying to look at types of websites, how similar things are, but again, this was just a first iteration, and then the second one was diving more into sort of the actual, again, the user needs mapped to features that you see here about users trying to understand big ideas for structuring certain components, trying to fill a workflow and knowledge gap between tutorials and professional websites, and also just the most important was just really understanding the differences between conflicting or different interpretations of websites. And again, so what you see here is that I really focus on this quarter is this idea of a simplified or stripped down view of the HTML, just to really help people strip away like the unnecessary parts and really get at what is sort of the essence of the structure that you're comparing and why that's important. And so the large second half of the quarter was focused on technical feasibility, and this was again HTML simplification and comparison. And what I basically did was first you collect a bunch of examples of real websites from the Alexa Top 100 most popular websites. One of those was BuzzFeed, and so also being able to grab the CSS so you can more or less recreate the visual outcome that you want. And then essentially I wrote a script that would just simplify the HTML and get rid of all the attributes, the classes, identify common tags, and then the second part of the technical feasibility was coming up with basically a document object model difference algorithm, or a DOM-diff algorithm as I've been calling it, using JQuegram, and basically it assigns a value from 0 to 1 of how similar the tree edit distance is once we've sort of processed these strings of HTML and structured them in terms of a nested, almost like it's basically a nested JSON object. And so as you can see here, I ran this then on a sort of just a preliminary demo of technical feasibility, was with the examples of BuzzFeed, Spotify, Twitter, YouTube, and a couple of, as you can see, a couple of other well-known websites. And when you run it, it basically returns, again, a bunch of correlations numbers that you can see here, and range, and a lot of the highest one unfortunately goes to 0.1, but that still gives us some information about that how similar YouTube and Etsy, or YouTube and Instagram, or YouTube and GitHub are in terms of their sort of nested structure. And so then I used a really simple k-means clustering on those, as you can see here, and sort of got these results of how similar certain websites are. So the most similar ones, for example, were largely centered around sort of Etsy and YouTube, and again, sort of seeing how what their wrapper classes are, and usually those meant that they had sort of either a common div as the overall wrapper, or even a header. And it's also obviously just looking at the sheer length of how much code it takes to create that component. We can also infer that that's why those numbers are the way they are. And so after doing that, I was also brainstorming again some more additional metrics that I'm still building out, and will continue to do that into next quarter, about how to define a programmatic way of understanding the structural similarity between two pieces of HTML code. So whether that's tree depth, how common tags are, the frequency of their appearance in the code, tree complexity in terms of how narrow or wide the DOM is, the overall number of objects, or how many, say, nested objects there are at every level. And so really what this quarter was about was sort of these key points, which is leveraging professional code to give learners a really quick starting point for whatever project or thing that they're building, and then giving them, again, like a stripped down version of what that looks like to help them really identify and understand those structural concepts a lot more easily. And finally, the structural comparison was better understanding the design decisions or impacts and trade-offs involved in the differences of code structure. And so really the next quarter, my next steps will be really figuring out what a usable, testable system looks like, that I can actually put in front of learners and intermediate or novice web developers, and see if this really does improve their workflow, or the speed, or how much they actually understand these concepts. And so to do that, I'm going to be shifting gears a little bit and thinking a little bit more about how we can crowdsource with experts, just because they are an extremely valuable resource in the web development community, and provide opinions and sort of qualitative observations and heuristics that quantitative measurements, as we've seen, are a little bit limited in. And so first, understanding how existing experts evaluate what is good and bad code, and then translating that into actual information and actual insights we can present to users. Continuing to again build metadata around a website component, and solidifying what are the key couple of metrics for really making those comparisons or identifying those similarities. And finally, the big chunk will be sort of piecing together how HTML and CSS interact. So far this quarter, I was really focused on just the HTML side of it. But obviously, the intricate connection between layout and presentation in web development is super important. And so I'll be working on more intuitive ways of connecting and demonstrating differences and similarities between both HTML and CSS.